The rain was coming down in thin, icy sheets over Los Angeles, the kind of weather that seems to scrape the color out of everything. In the back corner of an unassuming cafe tucked away from the main streets, a man sat alone at a small wooden table. His hair had gone a little grayer over the years, his eyes carrying that particular kind of weight people wear when they've kept too many truths bottled up for too long. Trevor Engelson didn't look like a man eager for revenge. He looked like a man finally ready to unload the burden of a story he had carried for over a decade. And the timing? It was no coincidence. It was Meghan Markle's 44th birthday. For years, his name had been little more than a footnote in Meghan's meteoric rise, the ex-husband before the prince. The Hollywood producer who had once been part of her life, but had been neatly cropped out of the fairy tale version she preferred the world to remember. Yet today, the man she left behind without so much as a face-to-face goodbye was prepared to reveal exactly what happened, and why he believes their marriage was never about love at all. He wasn't interested in throwing petty insults or dredging up small grievances. No, what he was about to share would cut to the core of Meghan's carefully cultivated image. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Trevor's voice was steady as he began, but there was a hard edge beneath it, as though each word had been sharpened over years of silence. He spoke of their first meeting, the way she looked at him as if he was the key to a door she'd been waiting her whole life to open. At the time, he'd taken it for attraction, maybe even fate. Only later would he wonder if she'd seen something else entirely. Not the man, but the opportunity. In Hollywood, ambition is like oxygen, and Trevor had it in spades when it came to his career. He'd worked his way into a comfortable position, producing films, making connections, shaking hands with the kind of people who could change someone's life with a single phone call. Meghan knew this. She understood the currency of access better than most. And according to Trevor, she cashed in every bit of it. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was slower, deliberate, measured. Trevor had no reason to doubt her feelings in those early days. They went to dinners, industry events, small gatherings where her smile and quick wit drew people in like moths to a flame. She had a way of making every conversation feel like the most important one you'd have all night. It was intoxicating, even for someone who'd seen his share of actors working a room. She didn't just charm you. She studied you, found the cracks, and filled them with exactly what you wanted to hear. The wedding came after years of dating. Friends described it as beautiful, intimate, the kind of event that felt more like a promise than a performance. But for Trevor, the years that followed would unravel that illusion thread by thread. At first, the changes were subtle. A new focus on her personal brand, more time spent away from home, a shift in how she prioritized her commitments. He supported her, of course he did. When Meghan landed her role on Suits and moved to Toronto, Trevor flew out often, sent care packages, made time for long-distance calls no matter how late they were for him. But there was a difference in her voice now, a coolness that hadn't been there before. It was as if the distance wasn't just physical, it was emotional, deliberate, and growing. What Trevor didn't know then was that those quiet gaps between them were being filled with a new version of Meghan. The woman he had married was transforming into someone else entirely. Someone who understood the game of image and perception, someone who no longer needed the man who had once been her biggest advocate. She was building something, and according to Trevor, he had been the scaffolding. Once the structure stood on its own, the scaffolding could be dismantled and discarded. The day it ended wasn't a shouting match or a tearful confrontation. It wasn't even a phone call. Trevor came home to find a package waiting. Inside was his wedding ring, returned without a note of explanation. No apology, no closure, no acknowledgement of the years they had shared. Just a silent finality, like the slamming of a door you didn't even realize was open. He would later tell friends that the act said more than any words ever could. It wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of his illusion about who she really was. For a long time, Trevor said nothing. In Hollywood, speaking out can burn bridges faster than any scandal. Besides, he wasn't ready to become tabloid fodder, the bitter ex-caricature people love to dismiss. He poured himself into his work, built new relationships, and moved on, at least on the surface. But every so often, her name would come up, first in small roles, then in bigger headlines, until one day the news broke. Meghan Markle was dating Prince Harry. Suddenly, she wasn't just the actress from Suits. She was a global figure, adored by millions, the face of a modern fairy tale. And Trevor, like everyone else, watched the narrative unfold, a narrative that left no room for the man who had once been her husband. Years passed, and still he stayed silent. But silence has a way of turning into pressure, and pressure eventually demands release. The more Meghan's story was told, the more Trevor recognized the gaps, the missing chapters, the quiet omissions that painted her as the self-made romantic heroine. On her 44th birthday, he decided it was time to tell his side. Not out of spite, but out of a need for truth. As he saw it, people deserved to know that the woman they celebrated was also the woman who had once used a marriage as a stepping stone and discarded it when it no longer served her. The cafe's hum faded as Trevor leaned forward, his hands clasped, eyes fixed on the table for a long moment before meeting his interviewer's gaze. He didn't raise his voice, didn't sneer or smirk. Instead, he began with a simple sentence that carried the weight of everything to come. She used our marriage to launch her career, and then she ended it by mail. It was the kind of statement that could ripple through the media like a shockwave, tearing at the seams of Meghan's carefully stitched image. The next chapters would reveal the details, the moments of calculated charm, the subtle distancing, the silent departure. But in that moment, in the dim light of a quiet cafe, Trevor Engelson finally broke a silence that had lasted far too long. And somewhere, Meghan Markle, halfway across the world and surrounded by the trappings of her royal past, was about to feel the tremor of a story she could no longer control. The truth, once set free, has a way of gathering speed. By the time Trevor's words reached the outside world, they were already beginning to shape a narrative that felt raw and unfiltered compared to the pristine, media-trained image the public had been given for years. He didn't sugarcoat his account, nor did he attempt to sensationalize it beyond what had already happened. The story, as he told it, didn't need embellishment. The reality was compelling enough. He spoke about the early signs he had ignored, not because he was blind to them, but because love, or what he thought was love, has a way of dulling the edges of doubt. She had a talent for making people believe in her, for convincing them that they were part of something bigger. With him, that meant convincing him they were building a life together. With others, it meant suggesting she was destined for greater things, that she had a vision for herself the rest of the world just hadn't caught up with yet. When they first married, Trevor had assumed their shared ambition would bind them together. They both understood long hours, high stakes, and the constant push for the next big project. They were, after all, part of an industry where everyone was chasing the next call, the next script, the next meeting. But ambition doesn't always work as a partnership. Sometimes, one person uses it as a ladder, and the other becomes just another rung. He remembered the days when Meghan's acting career was still finding its footing. She'd come home frustrated from auditions, discouraged after reading lines in a room full of strangers. Trevor was there to lift her spirits, to tell her she had the talent and resilience to keep going. He'd introduce her to people who could open doors, arrange dinners with casting directors, set up meetings with agents. At the time, it felt like supporting the woman he loved. Looking back, he wondered if those moments were investments she had already decided would have an expiration date. The role on Suits was the turning point, though neither of them realized it right away. At first, Trevor celebrated with her. It was a big break, steady work on a major series. But the job meant relocating to Toronto for most of the year. They told themselves they'd make it work. For a while, they did. There were flights back and forth, long phone calls at night, weekends stolen in between shoots. Yet slowly, the conversations grew shorter. The trips became less frequent. When they did see each other, she seemed distracted, already thinking about the next script, the next event, the next opportunity. One evening, Trevor recalled, he flew to Toronto unannounced, thinking it would be a romantic gesture. She was polite when she saw him, even warm in her greeting, but there was a flicker in her eyes he couldn't place. Surprise, yes, but also something cooler. It was as if his presence had disrupted a rhythm she had built in his absence. Later that night, he lay awake beside her, realizing that for the first time, he felt like a guest in his own marriage. Months later came the package. No warning, no discussion, no drawn-out argument. Just a ring, cold and gleaming, sitting at the bottom of a small box. The absence of words was almost worse than anything she could have said. It was clean, deliberate, final. In that silence, he understood that whatever they had shared was not ending in a moment of weakness or regret. It was ending because she had decided it no longer served her. Years would pass before he spoke about it publicly. In those years, he watched her step into bigger stages, larger spotlights. He saw her hand slip into Prince Harry's for the first time in photographs, saw the headlines bloom with phrases like modern fairy tale and self-made duchess. He saw the wedding watched by millions around the world, the kind of spectacle that made it seem as though her life had been building toward that moment all along. In all of it, there was no mention of the life they'd shared, no acknowledgement of the man who had once believed in her before anyone else did. Trevor's choice to speak now, on her birthday, was deliberate but not petty. At least, that's how he framed it. He claimed it wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. The public, he said, had been given a version of Meghan that omitted the cost of her climb, the sacrifices that were not hers to bear, and the people left behind in the pursuit of her image. His words carried the sting of someone who had lived through that omission and now wanted it recognized. The cafe where he sat that day was quiet, the kind of place where the hum of conversation blended with the hiss of the espresso machine. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist, leaving the sidewalks slick and shining. Trevor leaned back in his chair between answers, as though each memory pulled something out of him he wasn't sure he could get back. He didn't raise his voice or try to dramatize his account. If anything, the restraint made his story more compelling. The pain wasn't in the telling. It was in the years of silence before it. For the audience hearing this for the first time, the contrast was stark. The Meghan Markle they knew was a woman of poise, charity work, and modern royal influence. The Meghan of Trevor's account was something else entirely. Calculated, ambitious, and willing to close doors as swiftly as she had opened them. The truth, as always, was likely somewhere in between. But the timing of Trevor's words, paired with the details only he could provide, ensured that his side of the story could no longer be ignored. The introduction to his revelations was not just an exposé. It was a reintroduction to a chapter of Meghan's life that had been quietly erased. And as Trevor's words began to spread beyond the walls of that cafe, through news outlets and social media, one thing was clear. The carefully guarded narrative of Meghan Markle had just been cracked open. Somewhere, in the quiet of her own home, perhaps surrounded by the trappings of luxury and influence, Meghan would hear about Trevor's words. And maybe, just maybe, the woman who had always seemed unshakable would feel, for the first time in a long while, a tremor she couldn't control. It began in the kind of setting where stories often take root in Hollywood. Not at a red carpet premiere or an extravagant industry party, but at a low-lit gathering where ambition hummed quietly beneath the surface. Trevor Engelson was already carving out a space for himself as a producer. He wasn't a household name, but within certain circles, his work commanded respect. He knew the business, knew how to navigate its politics, and more importantly, he knew how to make things happen for people who caught his attention. That night, Meghan Markle was one of those people. She wasn't the global figure she would later become. At the time, Meghan was an actress with a modest resume, small roles, commercial work, and the relentless pursuit of something bigger. She had the smile of someone who understood the value of first impressions and the calculated poise of someone who intended to leave a mark. Trevor noticed her not just for her looks, but for her presence. There was something in the way she leaned into conversations, asking questions that felt personal while slipping in details about herself with precision. Their first real conversation was effortless on the surface, but with the benefit of hindsight, Trevor would later recall that it had a certain rhythm, as if Meghan had a mental checklist she was subtly working through. He was established enough to be useful, but not so famous that being with him would place her in a shadow she couldn't step out of. Their worlds overlapped neatly, yet she stood just outside his sphere, making herself intriguing without appearing desperate. In the weeks that followed, they began to see more of each other. There were dinners at quiet restaurants where the waitstaff knew Trevor by name, evenings at industry mixers where Meghan seemed to bloom under the soft glow of professional attention. She was attentive, curious, and flattering without being cloying. Trevor found himself confiding in her. His frustrations with certain projects, his hopes for future work, the constant balancing act between art and commerce. She listened like she understood every nuance, and whether by design or genuine empathy, her responses always left him feeling understood. For Meghan, these early days were about proximity, to him, to his world, to the connections he had cultivated over years of navigating Hollywood's intricate web. Trevor introduced her to people who could help her career, but he didn't think of it that way at the time. In his mind, he was sharing his life with someone he cared about, opening doors because he wanted her to succeed. Friends noticed how quickly they seemed to fit together. Meghan had a way of blending into Trevor's social and professional circles seamlessly. She didn't linger on the edges of conversations. She positioned herself in the heart of them. Within months, she had formed her own rapport with people Trevor had known for years. It was impressive, even charming, though a few of Trevor's closest friends would later admit they had wondered whether her interest in him was entirely personal. Trevor dismissed any quiet doubts. In his mind, relationships in Hollywood often came with overlapping personal and professional benefits. This wasn't unusual. It was the nature of their world. And besides, Meghan made him feel like they were a team. They spoke about future plans in ways that felt anchored, about how they could balance two careers without sacrificing the connection they were building. One of their early trips together was to Mexico, a getaway meant to be a break from the grind. Away from the industry, Trevor saw a more relaxed side of Meghan. They lounged on beaches, shared quiet dinners overlooking the ocean, and talked about the kind of life they wanted outside of the flashing lights. For Trevor, it was a glimpse of something steady and grounding. For Meghan, it may have been the moment she confirmed that Trevor was more than a romantic partner. He was a strategic one. Over time, their bond solidified into something that seemed, at least from the outside, unshakable. When Trevor proposed, it was with the certainty of a man who believed he had found someone who would be both a partner in love and an ally in life. Meghan said yes without hesitation. The engagement was low profile, lacking the public spectacle that would later define her second marriage. At the time, that simplicity felt genuine, an intimate decision between two people without the noise of outside expectation. Their wedding reflected that intimacy. Friends and family gathered in Jamaica for a celebration that was both laid back and deeply personal. Photos from that time show them smiling, relaxed, surrounded by people who seemed genuinely happy for them. The vows they exchanged were filled with promises of partnership, mutual support, and shared dreams. Trevor believed every word. He thought they were entering into a union built on trust and a shared vision for the future. But even in those early days, there were subtle currents beneath the surface. Meghan was increasingly focused on her career trajectory, and while Trevor's work allowed him to understand and support that, it also meant he recognized the intensity of her ambition. She didn't just want to work, she wanted to be known. She wasn't chasing fame recklessly. She was methodical, deliberate, and strategic about the steps she took. Trevor admired that drive, never suspecting it might one day be turned against the very life they were building together. Looking back, Trevor would identify moments that hinted at what was to come. The way Meghan lit up in the presence of influential people, the way she could pivot a conversation to highlight her own work without making it seem forced, the way she seemed to be constantly networking even in casual settings. At the time, these traits felt like strengths, qualities that would serve them well as a couple navigating an industry built on relationships. For Meghan, the marriage was the beginning of a new chapter, but perhaps not in the way Trevor imagined. She was stepping into a world with more access, more opportunity, and more potential leverage than she had ever had before. And whether consciously or unconsciously, she was already beginning to shape the narrative of her life in a way that placed her firmly in the driver's seat. In those early days, there was no public drama, no visible cracks. They were, to all appearances, a young couple in love, building a life together in one of the most competitive industries in the world. But the foundation of their relationship, trust, loyalty, shared goals, would eventually be tested by the very forces that had brought them together. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but the first faint winds were already stirring. And in time, those winds would grow into something that neither of them could ignore. When Trevor and Meghan returned from their Jamaican wedding, there was a sense of fresh momentum in their lives. The ceremony had been a celebration of not only their love, but of their shared ambition. the understanding that they were two people aligned in both personal commitment and professional drive. For Trevor, this meant continuing his steady climb as a producer in Hollywood, developing projects, nurturing talent, and securing deals that kept him firmly in the industry's inner circle. For Meghan, it meant finding a way to break past the endless cycle of minor roles and casting calls into something bigger, something lasting. Trevor's world was one Meghan had already begun to navigate before their marriage, but now she was anchored to it in a way that brought her closer to its core. The dinner parties, the casual Sunday brunches, the charity events. Each gathering was another chance to meet the kind of people who could make a career. And Trevor, without consciously realizing it at first, became her bridge to these opportunities. His introductions carried weight. A quiet word from him about Meghan's talent, her professionalism, or her charm could open doors that might otherwise have stayed firmly shut. It started innocently enough. He'd bring her along to networking events where she'd blend effortlessly into the crowd, mingling with producers, casting directors, and agents. She had a way of making those conversations feel personal, asking just the right questions, listening intently, and leaving people with the impression that she genuinely cared about their work. In truth, Meghan was building a mental map: who was connected to whom, where influence lay, and which relationships were worth cultivating further. Within months of their marriage, subtle shifts in Meghan's career began to take shape. She was landing more auditions for higher-profile roles. Scripts that might have bypassed her entirely were now finding their way into her hands. It wasn't all because of Trevor. She was talented, persistent, and strategic, but it was undeniable that his presence in her life amplified her reach. He was, as one mutual acquaintance later put it, a force multiplier for her ambitions. There were moments that stood out in Trevor's memory, like the night they attended a charity gala hosted by a prominent Hollywood philanthropist. Meghan, in an understated but elegant gown, worked the room with the precision of a seasoned diplomat. She knew when to laugh, when to compliment, and when to steer the conversation toward her latest projects without making it seem like self-promotion. By the end of the evening, she had secured lunch dates with 2 producers and exchanged numbers with a network executive's wife, all under the guise of casual conversation. Trevor was proud of her. He saw her as someone who could hold her own in any room, someone who was more than capable of taking advantage of the opportunities their life together presented. It never occurred to him that these same skills could also be used to navigate away from him entirely when the time came. As Meghan's network expanded, so did her schedule. She was attending more auditions, more events, and sometimes traveling alone for meetings. Trevor understood this was part of the industry, but there was a shift in tone. The evenings they used to spend discussing his projects and her auditions became less frequent. Conversations about their shared future were replaced by updates on who she had met, what was being pitched to her, and which opportunities seemed most promising. It was during this time that she began to talk about wanting a role that would put her on the map, something beyond the small, often forgettable parts she had been offered in the past. She spoke about characters with depth, storylines that resonated, and the kind of visibility that could make her a household name. Trevor listened, encouraged, and did what he could to help without crossing into territory that might make her feel like she hadn't earned it herself. Yet, the intersection of their careers was becoming increasingly apparent. Meghan's professional ascent and their marriage were intertwined in ways that would later make their unraveling all the more complicated. She was leveraging the credibility that came with being connected to someone established in Hollywood. In return, Trevor was investing in her potential, emotionally and socially, believing that her success would be a shared triumph. One of the more telling moments came at an after-party for a film premiere Trevor had been loosely involved in. Meghan, as his plus one, spent much of the evening away from his side, moving from group to group with practiced ease. When Trevor finally caught up with her, she was deep in conversation with a well-known showrunner. Her body language was open, engaged, and warm, the same qualities that had drawn him to her in the first place. But there was something else there too, a subtle undercurrent of calculation, as if she was weighing every word for its potential to advance her position. Friends of Trevor's began to notice the dynamic. Some remarked, without malice, that Meghan seemed driven. Others, more cautious, hinted that she might be playing a longer game than Trevor realized. But Trevor brushed these comments aside. Ambition was not a flaw in his eyes. It was a necessity in their world. He admired her focus, her ability to adapt, and her refusal to settle for mediocrity. Still, there were moments when the balance between personal and professional felt off-kilter. Meghan's commitments sometimes clashed with time they had set aside for themselves. On more than one occasion, Trevor found himself attending industry events alone because she had booked a last-minute meeting or been invited to a networking dinner she couldn't pass up. He understood the importance of seizing opportunities, but a quiet unease began to take root. The sense that their marriage was slowly being relegated to the background in service of something else. The turning point in this chapter of their life came when Meghan landed the audition for Suits. Trevor knew immediately that it was the kind of role that could change everything. It wasn't a small part in a one-off project. It was a regular role on a series with the potential for a long run. He celebrated with her when she got the part, proud to see her hard work paying off. What he didn't realize at the time was that Suits would not just alter Meghan's career trajectory, it would alter the trajectory of their marriage. The move to Toronto was framed as temporary, something they could work around. Trevor had the flexibility to travel, and Meghan promised to come back to Los Angeles whenever she could. But as she settled into her new life on set, surrounded by a different circle of colleagues and friends, the gap between them began to widen in ways that were less about geography and more about priorities. In hindsight, Trevor would look at this period as the moment when their marriage shifted from being a shared journey to parallel tracks that rarely intersected. He was still supporting her, still rooting for her success, but the life they were building together was no longer the central focus. The Hollywood gateway had opened for Meghan, and once she stepped through, the path ahead seemed to lead her further and further from the man who had helped her unlock it. When Meghan boarded the flight to Toronto for her first full stretch of filming on Suits, it was with a sense of excitement that could have lit up the entire cabin. She had landed what was, at that point, the most significant role of her career. For Trevor, watching her step into that opportunity was a moment of pride. He had been there through the rejections, the close calls, the auditions that went nowhere. Now, she had finally broken through. The plan, as they had agreed, was simple. They would make the long distance work. Love, they believed, could bridge the gap between Los Angeles and Toronto. In the first few weeks, it did. There were daily phone calls, sometimes long and detailed, other times short check-ins squeezed in between her shooting schedule and his meetings. Trevor sent care packages, books she had mentioned wanting to read, her favorite snacks, small mementos from their life together in Los Angeles. Meghan responded with gratitude, her voice warm and affectionate, making him feel like the distance was only physical. But as the weeks turned into months, subtle changes began to surface. Meghan's calls sometimes came late, after Trevor had been waiting up for hours. Their conversations shifted from personal updates to quick summaries of her day, often centered around her work. She was immersed in a new world, long hours on set, dinners with castmates, weekend events tied to the show. The circle of people she saw most often no longer overlapped with Trevor's. At first, Trevor told himself it was natural. This was her moment, and he wanted her to enjoy it fully. He kept himself busy with his own projects, convincing himself that their schedules would eventually sync. But there was an undercurrent of unease, a feeling that she was building a life in Toronto that didn't have much space for him in it. One of the first real signs came during what was supposed to be a romantic weekend. Trevor had flown to Toronto as a surprise, timing his arrival to coincide with a short break in her filming schedule. He imagined they would explore the city together, have dinner at one of her favorite new spots, maybe just spend quiet time away from the noise of their respective careers. When Meghan opened the door to her apartment, her smile was genuine, but fleeting. She hugged him warmly, but her body language was distracted. She explained that a few of her castmates had planned a group dinner that night, and she didn't want to miss it. Trevor went along, telling himself it was no big deal. But sitting at a long table in a bustling restaurant, listening to her animated conversation with her new friends, he felt more like an outsider than a husband. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Meghan seemed to be juggling her time with him against a calendar already filled with social obligations tied to her work. There were moments when they connected, a quiet coffee together in the morning, a late-night walk through the city, but they felt like brief pauses in her increasingly busy life. Back in Los Angeles, Trevor tried to shake off the feeling. They were still talking, still visiting each other when they could. But the visits became less frequent, and when they did happen, Meghan's attention often seemed split. She spoke more and more about people he had never met, stories from set that he could only partially follow, and plans for the show's future that stretched years ahead. The emotional gap widened slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A missed call here, a postponed trip there. When Trevor brought it up, Meghan would reassure him that nothing had changed between them. She was just focused on making the most of her opportunity. She insisted that they were still on the same page, still moving forward together. And Trevor, wanting to believe her, accepted those assurances. Yet the truth was becoming harder to ignore. They were living in two separate worlds, each with its own demands, its own pace. Meghan's rise on Suits meant she was increasingly in the public eye. She began attending industry events in Toronto without Trevor, her photo appearing in local press alongside her co-stars. She was building a public persona that was distinct from her life as his wife. Trevor noticed that when they were together, Meghan sometimes seemed more focused on capturing moments for social media than on experiencing them. A dinner date might pause mid-conversation so she could take the perfect photo. A casual walk could turn into an impromptu mini photo shoot. It wasn't that Trevor begrudged her the attention. He understood the role image played in the industry, but it was becoming clear that her focus was shifting toward cultivating a brand. One incident stood out in his mind. They had planned a weekend getaway during one of Meghan's rare breaks from filming. Trevor envisioned it as a chance to reconnect, away from the distractions of work and publicity. But just hours into their trip, Meghan received an invitation to a networking event back in the city. She debated for all of 5 minutes before deciding to cut their weekend short. She framed it as a professional necessity, an opportunity she couldn't turn down. Trevor didn't argue, but the disappointment settled deep. Friends of Trevor's began to notice the changes as well. When he spoke about Meghan, his tone was still affectionate, but there was a guardedness that hadn't been there before. He no longer talked about their future in concrete terms. Instead, his comments were peppered with "we'll see" and "hopefully." Some urged him to address the growing distance directly, to have a serious conversation about where things were headed. But Trevor held back, clinging to the belief that the distance was temporary, that once the initial rush of her success leveled out, they would find their rhythm again. Meanwhile, Meghan's life in Toronto was expanding in ways that made Los Angeles feel increasingly far away. She developed close friendships with her co-stars, became a regular at certain restaurants and events, and even began participating in local charity functions. She was building a support system that didn't include Trevor, and whether she realized it or not, it was changing the dynamic between them. By the time their second wedding anniversary approached, the cracks were harder to ignore. Their celebrations were modest, squeezed in between filming and business meetings. Meghan was gracious and affectionate in public, but in private, she often seemed preoccupied, as if her mind was already elsewhere. Trevor felt the shift in her energy, the way she no longer lingered in conversations, the way her eyes drifted when he spoke about his own work. Looking back, Trevor would see this period as the slow unraveling of their marriage. It wasn't marked by a single dramatic fight or betrayal, but by a gradual drifting apart. The distance wasn't just the miles between Los Angeles and Toronto. It was the widening space between who they had been as a couple and who they were becoming as individuals. In his mind, he still believed they could find their way back. But Meghan's path was leading her somewhere else entirely. And though he didn't know it yet, the moment when she would close the door for good was already taking shape. The morning it happened began like any other. Trevor was at home in Los Angeles, the late summer heat already pressing in through the windows. He had meetings scheduled later in the day, a call with a producer friend, and plans to meet a few colleagues for drinks in the evening. Meghan was in Toronto, deep into her second season on Suits. Their communication had been sparse that week. A couple of text messages, one brief call that ended with her saying she had to run to set. Nothing unusual, he told himself. The distance had taught him to accept gaps in contact. When the knock came at the door, he wasn't expecting anything. The courier handed him a small, padded envelope. His name was written in neat block letters across the front. There was no return address. He didn't think much of it at first. Packages arrived at his home all the time. But as he turned it over in his hands, the weight of it struck him as odd. It wasn't heavy, but there was something inside that shifted slightly with movement. He tore open the seal, tipping the contents into his palm. A small jewelry box slid out, the kind designed to hold a single ring. For a moment, he didn't process what he was looking at. Then he opened it. Inside, gleaming against the velvet lining, was his wedding band. No note, no explanation, just the ring. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Trevor sat down without realizing he had moved, his mind racing. He checked the envelope again, certain there had to be something more, a letter, a card, a few words to explain. There was nothing. The silence of it all was deafening. For a long time, he just stared at the ring. It was the same one he had worn every day since their wedding in Jamaica, the same one that had symbolized the promises they made to each other in front of friends and family. Now it was sitting in a box on his desk, returned to him like an item borrowed and no longer needed. The gesture was so final, so deliberate, that it left no room for misinterpretation. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a test. This was an ending. When he finally picked up his phone, he hesitated. What was there to say? He could call her, demand an explanation, but in that moment, the absence of words seemed to be the point. The act itself, sending the ring back without a single line, was the message. And it was a message delivered with the kind of precision that didn't happen by accident. He didn't call her that day. Instead, he went through the motions of his schedule, his mind a blur. At drinks that evening, he barely touched his glass. Friends noticed his distraction, but he brushed off their questions. How could he explain something so simple and yet so devastating? How could he put into words the way an object so small could carry the weight of an entire relationship's collapse? In the days that followed, he tried to piece together the timeline. When had she decided it was over? Was it during one of their recent visits, when she seemed distant and preoccupied? Was it in the middle of a long day on set, when their marriage felt more like a logistical inconvenience than a partnership? He thought back to the weekend getaway she had cut short for a networking event, the surprise visit to Toronto where he felt like an outsider. Maybe the decision had been building for months, disguised under polite reassurances and careful avoidance of hard conversations. The lack of confrontation was what stung the most. There was no fight, no tearful exchange, no attempt to salvage what they had built. Just a package, a ring, and silence. It felt transactional, as if their marriage had been reduced to an item on a checklist, something to be crossed off cleanly and without fanfare. Trevor's friends were divided in their reactions when he eventually told them. Some were furious on his behalf, calling it cold and cowardly. Others, more measured, suggested that maybe this was her way of avoiding unnecessary pain, that perhaps she thought sparing him a drawn-out conversation was a kindness. Trevor wasn't sure which interpretation hurt more. In the weeks that followed, he noticed the shift in how he remembered their relationship. Memories that had once been warm and reassuring now felt tainted by the knowledge of how it ended. The early days of their marriage, the small gestures of affection, even the moments of shared ambition. All of it was overshadowed by the image of that box arriving at his door. There were times he considered calling her, if only to demand an acknowledgement that what they had shared had been real. But each time, he stopped himself. If she could end it in silence, what good would come from forcing a conversation? What could she possibly say that would make the ring's return any less final? Meanwhile, life around him carried on. Meghan continued filming, her career gaining traction. Press coverage of Suits grew, and with it, her public profile. Photos of her at events began to surface more frequently, her smile bright and effortless. There was no sign in those images of a woman who had just ended a marriage. If anything, she seemed lighter, freer, as though shedding the relationship had been a calculated move to clear her path. Trevor, on the other hand, carried the weight of the unanswered questions. He found himself replaying conversations, looking for hidden meanings. He thought about the times she had spoken vaguely about wanting more from life, the times she had expressed frustration with the limitations of their long-distance arrangement. In retrospect, it was as if she had been preparing to let go long before she actually did. One evening, months after receiving the ring, Trevor sat with a close friend who had known them both well. They talked for hours, sifting through the history of the relationship. At one point, his friend leaned back and said quietly, "Maybe the way she ended it tells you everything you need to know about why she started it." The words landed heavily. Trevor didn't respond, but they stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Over time, the sting dulled, but the memory of that day never fully faded. It was a clean break in the most literal sense, but it left behind a fracture that reshaped the way Trevor looked at trust, at commitment, at the intersection of love and ambition. The package had arrived without warning, without ceremony, but the truth it carried was far from sudden. It was the final act in a story that had been quietly unraveling for a long time, a story that, for Trevor, would never again be as simple as it seemed in the beginning. When word began to filter through Trevor's closest circle that the marriage had ended with a ring in the mail, reactions were swift and sharp. It wasn't just the shock of the breakup. Hollywood marriages come and go. It was the way it had been done. The absence of confrontation, the refusal to explain, the clinical neatness of it all. For people who had watched the relationship grow from its early days, it was jarring to imagine it ending with so little ceremony. In the beginning, most of Trevor's friends kept their opinions to themselves. They knew he was still raw, still processing. But as weeks turned into months, stories began to surface. Anecdotes from the years before the split that now seemed like early warning signs. Over coffee, over late-night drinks, the picture of Meghan that emerged was far less romantic than the one the public knew. One friend from Trevor's college days remembered a dinner not long after the wedding. Meghan had been charming, attentive, but during a moment when Trevor stepped away from the table, she leaned across to ask about a particular studio executive the friend had recently worked with. It wasn't a casual inquiry. She wanted specifics, his influence, his temperament, whether he was open to meeting new talent. At the time, the friend chalked it up to ambition. In hindsight, it felt like calculated positioning. Another mutual acquaintance, a casting agent who had met Meghan through Trevor, recalled an afternoon when she dropped by the office unannounced. She was there under the pretense of picking up Trevor for lunch, but before leaving, she lingered to ask about upcoming projects, subtly steering the conversation toward roles that might suit her. The agent had been impressed by her confidence, but also noted the way she navigated around mentioning Trevor's involvement, as if keeping the interaction entirely her own. These weren't sinister acts on their own. In an industry where opportunity often comes from being in the right room at the right time, Meghan's behavior could easily be seen as savvy networking. But layered against the abrupt end of the marriage, they took on a different shade. Friends began to speculate that she had been cultivating her independence from the start, building a professional foundation that would stand with or without Trevor. At gatherings after the split, Meghan's name inevitably came up. Some people spoke of her ambition with admiration, saying she knew what she wanted and went after it. Others were less forgiving, calling her opportunistic, even ruthless. A few admitted they had never fully trusted her, describing moments when her warmth felt rehearsed, her interest in others transactional. One of Trevor's oldest friends, a man who had been at their wedding in Jamaica, confessed that he had felt uneasy even then. She was radiant, sure, he told Trevor months after the breakup, but there was a part of her that seemed elsewhere, like she was always scanning the horizon for what's next. At the time, he hadn't wanted to dampen the mood with his observations. Now, he wished he had said something. There were also stories that painted Meghan as someone who knew how to play both sides of a relationship, affectionate and supportive in private, but careful to maintain a public image that emphasized her own autonomy. A friend from the film festival circuit recalled seeing Meghan at an industry event alone while Trevor was away on business. She had introduced herself simply as an actress, without mentioning her marriage, and spent much of the evening in conversation with a well-known director. Nothing inappropriate, the friend clarified, but it was like she existed in a version of herself that didn't have a husband. For Trevor, hearing these stories was complicated. On one hand, they validated the unease he had begun to feel in the last year of their marriage. On the other, they forced him to confront the possibility that the foundation of their relationship had never been as solid as he believed. The Meghan his friends described was still the woman he knew. Charismatic, driven, magnetic, but now those qualities seemed inextricably linked to a strategic vision that had little to do with him. Not all the recollections were negative. Some friends genuinely believed Meghan had cared for Trevor, at least in the early years. They spoke of vacations where she seemed genuinely relaxed and happy, of moments when she encouraged Trevor to take risks in his career, of the way she once comforted him after a project fell apart. But even these friends admitted there was an edge to her, a sense that no matter how close she seemed, there was always a part of her holding back. The conversations inevitably turned to the manner of the breakup. Why the ring in the mail? Why no conversation, no meeting, no phone call? Theories varied. Some believed it was a power move, a way to assert total control over the narrative and avoid any emotional vulnerability. Others thought it was avoidance, a refusal to deal with the discomfort of ending things face to face. A few suggested it was a blend of both, calculated and convenient. One particularly blunt friend told Trevor, "She didn't just leave you, she erased you. The way she did it makes it impossible for you to argue or negotiate. It's done the moment you open that box." That sentiment stuck with him. The finality of the gesture had been one of the hardest parts to process. Over time, as Trevor began to speak more openly about his side of the story, his friends' accounts became part of the larger narrative. They weren't just gossip, they were context. Each memory, each observation added another layer to the understanding of how a marriage that had once seemed stable could dissolve so completely. The public, of course, knew none of this. Meghan's public persona remained intact, even elevated, as she transitioned from television actress to public figure. Her rise was framed as the story of a woman who had built herself from the ground up, who had navigated the brutal entertainment industry with determination and grace. Trevor's role in that story was invisible. Among his friends, however, the picture was far more nuanced. They saw him not as the bitter ex-husband of tabloid headlines, but as someone who had been caught in the orbit of a person whose ambitions ultimately outpaced the relationship. Some encouraged him to tell his story sooner rather than later, to counter the one-sided version circulating in the media. Others advised him to move on quietly, to let the past stay buried. For a long time, Trevor leaned toward silence. Speaking out felt like lowering himself into the muck of celebrity gossip, a place he had no interest in living. But the more he heard from the people who had been there, who had seen the small cracks forming long before he had, the more he began to feel that staying quiet wasn't protecting his dignity. It was allowing a false narrative to go unchallenged. By the time he decided to break his silence, the accounts from his friends had become more than just background noise. They were part of the evidence, the threads that, when woven together, told a very different story from the one Meghan had presented to the world. And as Trevor prepared to share that story, he understood that he wasn't just speaking for himself. He was giving voice to the perspective that had been erased along with him. By the time Meghan's career was gaining steady traction on Suits, the public had begun to build a version of her in their minds. A version carefully shaped by magazine profiles, talk show appearances, and curated glimpses on social media. She was the polished, articulate actress with a humanitarian streak, a modern woman navigating fame with poise. To the casual observer, she appeared grounded, relatable, and entirely self-made. That image was no accident. Meghan understood the value of perception in the entertainment industry. Every red carpet appearance, every charity initiative, every interview answer was an opportunity to reinforce a brand. The ambitious but approachable professional. Even her wardrobe choices seemed calculated to balance accessibility with sophistication. The public saw a woman who seemed to have it all: talent, beauty, and a moral compass pointing toward good causes. But behind closed doors, according to those who had known her in the years before her royal chapter, the version of Meghan that existed away from cameras was more complex. She was driven, yes, but also intensely strategic. Friends described her as someone who could read a room instantly, adapting her tone and demeanor to suit the audience. She knew when to be warm and engaging, when to hold back, and when to lean into vulnerability as a tool to draw people closer. Trevor had witnessed this duality often. At industry events, he watched her glide between conversations, her posture and expression shifting subtly depending on who she was speaking to. With actors, she could talk shop about scripts and character work. With producers, she focused on marketability, audience reach, and the business side of entertainment. With journalists, she emphasized personal anecdotes that framed her as relatable and hardworking. In their private life, Meghan's attention to image extended beyond her career. She was meticulous about how their relationship appeared to others. At dinners with friends, She would steer conversations towards shared achievements and lighthearted stories, rarely letting disagreements or personal struggles show. She understood that in a town where gossip could travel faster than truth, controlling the narrative was as important as the narrative itself. This wasn't inherently malicious. Many in the industry maintained a public persona distinct from their private selves. But what unsettled some of Trevor's friends was the sense that Meghan's curated image sometimes came at the expense of authenticity. There were moments when her warmth felt rehearsed, her laughter perfectly timed, as if she were already imagining how the scene might read in print or play on camera. As her visibility grew, so did her commitment to controlling how she was perceived. Meghan became more selective about the interviews she gave, the events she attended, and even the company she kept. Publicly, she was the embodiment of grace under pressure. Privately, Trevor began to notice a sharper edge, an impatience for anything that didn't serve her forward momentum. One example stood out vividly in his mind. They had been invited to a small, informal gathering hosted by one of Trevor's longtime friends, a screenwriter known for his low-key demeanor and disinterest in Hollywood politics. It was the kind of event where people came to relax, not network. Meghan, however, spent most of the evening engaged with the only two people in the room who had current projects in development. She wasn't rude, but her focus was unmistakable. On the drive home, she spoke enthusiastically about the potential connections she'd made, barely mentioning the host. To Trevor, these moments were early signs that her public image, the warm, socially invested personality, was increasingly becoming a full-time role. The Meghan he saw in private was still capable of genuine affection and humor, but those moments seemed to shrink as her career advanced. Conversations about their personal life often gave way to discussions about her work, her public appearances, and the opportunities on the horizon. This growing divide between image and reality became more pronounced when Meghan began to take on causes outside of acting. She involved herself in charity work and advocacy, aligning with organizations that complemented her public brand. On the surface, her involvement was admirable, and Trevor supported her efforts. But he couldn't help noticing how these activities were often timed to coincide with promotional cycles for her projects. A charity visit would be followed by a press interview where the cause and her work were discussed side by side. Again, in Hollywood, this kind of synergy was common, even smart. But to Trevor, it felt like every aspect of her life was becoming part of the same carefully managed campaign. Their marriage, once a partnership rooted in shared goals and mutual support, was now an accessory to a broader narrative in which Meghan was the central character. The contrast between her image and his reality of life with her became most apparent in how the public responded to her. Fans and journalists described her as humble and down-to-earth, qualities Trevor had once believed in wholeheartedly. But in private, she could be demanding, especially when it came to the details of how she was presented. She scrutinized photographs, weighed in on lighting and angles, and sometimes rejected appearances that didn't align with the vision she wanted to project. There was also a shift in how Meghan related to Trevor in public settings. In their early years, she had been openly affectionate, quick to reference him in conversations or acknowledge his support. As time went on, she spoke less about him in interviews, sometimes omitting him entirely from narratives about her career path. The omission wasn't glaring to the public, but to Trevor, it was a quiet erasure, a way of reframing her story as entirely self-driven. Friends who noticed this pattern began to question whether the marriage fit into Meghan's long-term vision for herself. To some, it seemed inevitable that she would eventually outgrow the relationship, or decide it no longer served her image. Trevor resisted this idea for as long as he could, telling himself that the woman the public adored was still the same one he had married. But as the gap between her public persona and private reality widened, it became harder to reconcile the two. The real turning point came when Meghan's team, publicists, agents, and advisors, began to take a more active role in shaping her schedule and public appearances. Decisions about where she went and who she was seen with were increasingly run through a filter of brand strategy. Invitations that once would have been automatic yes, like dinner with Trevor's friends or family gatherings, were sometimes declined because they didn't align with her current positioning. For Trevor, this shift was both disorienting and isolating. He had once been her closest confidant, the person she came to for advice. Now, It felt as if her inner circle had expanded to include people whose influence on her far outweighed his own. The marriage was still intact, but its place in her hierarchy of priorities was slipping. The public continued to embrace the Meghan they saw, the articulate actress, the humanitarian, the rising star. But Trevor, and those closest to him, were seeing another version emerge. This Meghan was laser-focused on advancement, willing to adapt her story, her relationships, and even her marriage to fit the image she wanted the world to believe. It wasn't a sudden transformation. It was a gradual, deliberate process, built decision by decision, appearance by appearance. And for Trevor, the question was no longer whether the public image matched reality. It was whether there was still room in that reality for him at all. The months following Meghan's steady rise on Suits marked a shift so pronounced that even people on the periphery of her life could sense it. For years, she had been climbing the industry ladder rung by rung, taking whatever roles came her way, hustling for visibility. But now, the climb was different. The footholds were more secure, the opportunities larger, and the spotlight brighter. She was no longer an actress fighting for scraps. She was a name with weight, someone who could walk into a meeting and have the room lean forward with interest. Trevor, watching from the side, felt a mix of pride and disquiet. On one hand, he admired her relentless drive and the way she'd maneuvered herself into this position. On the other, he couldn't ignore that with each step she took forward, their shared life seemed to be left a little further behind. It wasn't just about geography anymore, it was about trajectory. Meghan's path was arcing upward at a speed and in a direction that no longer seemed to run parallel to his. Suits became the platform from which she launched not just more acting opportunities, but a carefully curated public presence. She began appearing on panels, speaking at events, and aligning herself with causes that reflected well on her brand. She didn't just show up to act. She showed up to be seen, to position herself as more than just a performer. To Trevor, it sometimes felt as though she was constructing a version of herself for public consumption, and every choice she made fed into that image. Her social calendar became more demanding, filled with events that had little to do with Trevor or their shared friends. There were charity galas, fashion shows, networking dinners, and brand partnerships, all designed to elevate her profile beyond the world of television. While she still returned to Los Angeles when she could, those trips were often short and packed with her own commitments. Time with Trevor was slotted between interviews, fittings, and photo shoots. Trevor tried to adapt. He traveled to Toronto more often, attended events with her, and made an effort to integrate into her new social world. But the shift in dynamics was undeniable. In Los Angeles, Trevor had been the one with the stronger network, the one opening doors for Meghan. In Toronto, and within the circles she was now frequenting, the balance of influence had tipped. She was the one people sought out, the one whose name carried the weight in the introductions. He began to notice subtle changes in how Meghan interacted with him in public. She was still warm, but there was a distance, a polished veneer that hadn't been there before. In interviews, when asked about her personal life, she became more guarded. References to Trevor grew rarer, replaced by anecdotes about her work, her travels, and her thoughts on social issues. If their marriage came up at all, it was in passing, as if it were just one part of a much larger and more important picture. Privately, the space between them widened. Conversations about their future were vague, with Meghan often redirecting the topic to her upcoming projects or travel plans. When Trevor tried to discuss concrete plans, buying a home together, starting a family, finding a way to spend more consistent time in the same city, Meghan would nod along but rarely commit to specifics. There was always another shoot, another opportunity, another obligation. Friends of Trevor's who visited Toronto noticed the same thing. They would return to Los Angeles with polite but telling comments about how busy she seemed, how hard it was to get her attention even during downtime. Some speculated that her growing independence was a natural byproduct of her success. Others were less generous, suggesting that she was deliberately creating distance, preparing for a future that didn't necessarily include Trevor. One incident crystallized this suspicion for Trevor. Meghan had been invited to speak at an international conference on women's empowerment, a significant milestone that would put her in front of influential leaders, celebrities, and media outlets. Trevor had cleared his schedule to attend, assuming it was an event they would experience together. But a week before the trip, Meghan told him she thought it would be better if she went alone. She explained it as a matter of focus. She wanted to fully immerse herself in the event without worrying about being a hostess. To Trevor, it felt like a polite way of saying his presence wasn't part of the image she wanted to project there. As her profile grew, so did the speculation in the press. Tabloids began